Okay, good morning, everyone. Why don't we get started? We are very excited today to have Gregor Schubert here to present on the impact of cultural preferences on homeownership. Gregor, take it away.
Thank you so much, David. And thank you so much for having us in the seminar. So this is joint work with Caitlin Gorbach at UT Austin. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the comments and questions afterwards. So this project starts out with the idea that the US is a melting pot. Immigrants to the US ultimately retain some of their cultural norms when they're immigrating and are not fully assimilating into society. And as a result of that, we have a pass-through of cultural norms from the countries that people are coming from to their lives in the US. And this has been documented in a number of different contexts, including in women's behavior in labor markets and labor market participation, in the degree to which people commit crimes. There's also a lot of evidence that some of these effects ultimately wear out. So cultural attainment and income dissipate as we go sort of down the list of different generations. And so in later generations, people catch up to US-born natives in terms of those demographics. However, there's less evidence of how immigrants integrate into American housing markets. So and there's two facts that we you find if you look into this. So on the one hand, there is a lot more volatility and a big gap in terms of the homeownership rate between natives and the foreign-born in the US. So if you look on the left-hand side, and the homeownership rate among foreign-born Americans. And as you can see, there's sort of a big gap on average in terms of the tendency towards owning a home between those who are born in the US and those who immigrate to the US. And so that's about a gap of around sort of 20-ish percentage points in the year 2000. So that's pretty large. And another thing you might notice here, which will become relevant a bit later on in the talk, is that the homeownership rate among the foreign-born seems a little bit more volatile. So it goes up a little bit more during the boom, and then also declines a little bit more during the bust. So there seems to be maybe a difference in terms of homeownership dynamics as well between the foreign-born and then the other graph on the right shows the degree to which foreign-born residents catch up to natives as they spend more time in the US. So on the bottom axis, it plots the years since the immigration of the household head. So as you go to the right, people have been in the US for longer. And then on the vertical axis, it plots a residualized effect on homeownership. So we're controlling there for all the other things that might be explaining homeownership, like household income, how old someone is, their marital status, or their educational attainment. And so even controlling for those things, when people first come to the US, if you just look at the zero there, there's this sort of 20 percentage point gap. And then as you move further to the right, and they spend more time in the US, the gap gets smaller, but it doesn't really go away even after they spent a long time in the US. And so there's sort of a persistent gap there over time.
Simon has his hand raised.
Yeah, I have a question about this increase. So is that taking into account the visa? Given, you come to the US as an immigrant, but you might stay just a couple of years, you don't buy anything. But once you get your green card, you start buying. Or do you take this into account or not?
That's an important point. That's something we'd love to take into account. It's hard for us to do because we do this with census data, which doesn't which does not ask people about their legal status in the U.S. If they're on a visa or a green card or something like that. So yeah, good point that the sort of permanence of how long people are in the U.S. might play a role. We'd hope that sort of plays less of a role as you get into the longer years people have spent in the U.S. So if people have spent 20 years or so in the U.S., presumably then some kind of permanent residency, and so we would think that more permanent status should also express itself in homeownership. But no, we can't pick. We don't know what exactly people's sort of legal status is or visa status in this setting. All right.
And Yi has a hand up.
Okay.
Oh, hi, Greg. It's E. Yeah, just something very interesting on the left-hand side, that why the home ownership is increasing during the financial crisis for the foreign-born immigrants. So did you include them also, like, I assume they're just like was born outside the country of origin, but they have their parents. Did you check about maybe their parents was also moving with them? So are you counting about the parents or like just themselves? It's a bit interesting here. See the difference during the during the financial crisis. Thank you.
Yeah. So we're focusing here on household heads who are between 18 and 69 years old and are foreign-born themselves. It's possible that they moved with their parents when they moved here, but we require them to be adults now. So this doesn't include. So I guess this doesn't include children in the counting, but it could be people who immigrated as children. We do have one of our later analyses. We sort of repeat that for people who immigrated as children to sort of see if that makes a big difference. And as far as we find, sort of immigrating as children versus not doesn't make a big difference to any of these dynamics. Yeah, so I think that it doesn't make a big difference for what I'm going to tell you, but in this case, we're focusing on people who are adults now and who may have immigrated as children with their parents, but we can't really distinguish whether or not their parents were foreign-born. Any other questions? Okay, all right. So why does this matter? Why do we care about homeownership among the foreign-born? So homeownership is a key driver of financial outcomes. And as E just mentioned, sort of the great financial crisis is obviously an important event in recent history where homeownership or lack of access to homeownership played an important role in terms of overall economic dynamics. So lower access to homeownership might prevent households from being able to build wealth. Access to homeownership might also lead to default and foreclosure on the home, which then is associated with sort of the economic fallout from that. At the same time, if lots of immigrants in particular locations all choose to buy homes to a greater or smaller degree, that could lead to local house price volatility, or buying a home in a particular location could expose immigrants to local house price risk that might correlate with other risks in their financial portfolio. And so in general, when and whether immigrants enter into homeownership and sort of make this big financial decision to acquire a home is a really important factor in terms of both enabling immigrants' economic mobility and also driving their economic and financial outcomes at the end of the day. And so in this paper, we ask whether or not homeownership norms in the countries of origins where migrants to the US come from have an impact on their homeownership when they're in the US, and as a result of that, whether or not these homeownership norms in other countries end up driving financial outcomes among US immigrants. And so, sorry, my screen just went white. Let me just restart my slides. Sorry, I can't, my slides went white and I can't see them anymore. But, okay, let me reshare. Sorry, I need to reopen my slides. My Adobe crashed. Give me a second. But let me continue talking through this. So So in this paper, so we asked this question of whether or not homeownership matters for economic outcomes in the US. And ultimately, what we do is we document a pass-through of cultural norms in homeownership. So we find that for a large sample of US foreign-born households, the country of origin that they're coming from matters for whether or not they're going to end up as homeowners. And that is very robust to controlling for a large range of socioeconomic, demographic, and country of origin characteristics, as well as sort of other financial outcomes that might matter. Okay.
Jeff has a hand up.
All right, now you should be able to.
So one issue here is selection bias, because you're only observing immigrants who stay in the U.S.
Yes.
Right, and it could very well be that cultural norms have a say in the selection bias process. And so, how do you deal with this this selection bias that you're not observing immigrants who go back to their home countries, for example?
So how exactly would you imagine this bias? So I guess the way I would think about it is that if there's a bias in terms of which people stay in the US, so if people who have a higher tendency to homeownership in their home country are more likely to stay in the US, that by itself would change the tenure of people in the US, or how long they stay, and sort of the time they have spent in the US. But if it doesn't have an impact on their homeownership independent of that, then we shouldn't find an effect once we condition on how long people have been in the US, as well as sort of their age and other variables related to that. And so one thing we condition on is how long people have been in the US. And so that hopefully should pick up on this selection that you talk about with regard to how long people are likely to stay in the US. One thing I'll show you as well is one thing we control for is sort of average characteristics of people from that country who have come to the US, right? So there could be a sense that people from particular countries who move to the US as a group, in general, sort of tend to have whatever it is, larger families, or tend to be older in general. And so we'll actually do one robustness check where we control just for the average characteristics of that particular origin country group in the US, other than homeownership, of course, and show that the results are basically unaffected by whether or not you control for those average characteristics. So hopefully that would address the concerns about selection that you had in mind. Okay.
Thanks.
All right, so we show that this pass-through exists and is large, and then we look at the implications of that. And so we develop a sort of stylized model of tenure choice with cultural norms and credit constraints, and show that you can sort of in that model predict the baseline result that cultural preference for homeownership should affect tenure choices, but also that households that have in general a higher affinity for homeownership should have a higher probability of choosing homeownership for any possible tax rate that they might face, and in particular that high affinity foreign-born groups that are more interested in homeownership should respond more strongly to credit shocks. And so when credit supply becomes more available, there's an easing of credit supply, those groups should transition into homeownership at faster rates than groups that have sort of a lower affinity for homeownership. And so that's something that we test, and we find that that this is actually the case. So we construct a new measure of credit shocks and show that these high homeownership affinity foreign-born groups respond much more strongly to these credit supply shocks in terms of increasing their homeownership when credit supply increases. We have ongoing work on also looking at how this affects housing wealth formation as well as defaults among these groups, but I'm not going to be able to tell you about that today yet. All right. So where does this fit in the literature? So there's been this growing literature on cultural norms that represent some sort of exogenous variation or latent demand for various economic factors, including homeownership. And so in this paper, we focus on immigrant homeownership and what that does to sort of financial outcomes in the US. And there's a number of different papers that this relates to. There have been other papers that have documented in general that there's a link between where people are coming from and homeownership, either in other settings or focusing on different populations. There's, of course, also large literature just generally looking at the economic outcomes of immigrants to the US and how immigrants affect housing markets, sort of looking at a more housing market level, whether or not flows of immigrants, for instance, might drive up house prices. And then there's a somewhat smaller literature that this paper relates to about the impact of credit cycles on marginal home buyers. And so there have been findings that for instance, related to subprime borrowers and historically disadvantaged groups in the US, that they were more likely to enter into homeownership during the housing boom of the 2000s, but then were also more likely to be exposed to default and foreclosures when the housing cycle turned down. And so in this paper, we contribute a simple model and evidence that homeownership passes through from the origin country to behavior in the US in a way that is robust, persistent, and large for the majority of foreign-born Americans, and also that this pass-through of homeownership culture from the country people originate from ends up affecting the response to credit supply shocks in particular, and the default behavior of residents. Okay, I'm going to give you a quick idea of how we compile data on this. And then I'll talk about first how homeownership norms in origin countries affect tenure choice in general, and then how households with a different tendency towards homeownership end up responding differently to credit supply shocks. So first, the data. So how do we know what the affinity for homeownership is in people's countries of origin? So to figure this out, we compiled data for 83 countries of origin of homeownership rates by marital status. And so our primary source there is this great resource that IPUMS provides, which is International Census Microdata, which sort of harmonizes items in censuses around the world. And provides them in a standardized format. And so what that allows us to do, it allows us to restrict the sample and sort of construct homeownership variables in a comparable way across different countries. And so we look at household heads who are 18 to 69 years old and end up being able to construct homeownership rates by marital status for around 72% of the foreign-born population in the US, based on the countries that are sort of represented in this international census data set. In order to make sure that we have good coverage of the biggest countries among the foreign-born in the US, we also supplement this with hand-collected data from surveys in India and China that were not represented in the IPUMS data. One worry might be that this IPUMS harmonized census data is somehow selected in a particular way, or has other sort of issues with it. And so one robustness check we do is actually we collect average homeownership rates. We can't find those by marital status, but we can collect those on average from other data sources. So we hand collect data on international homeownership rates from UN statistics, OECD, and so on and so forth. Again, we can't differentiate by marital status, so this makes it sort of less useful in terms of precisely capturing homeownership norms. But we find that there's a really high correlation between these alternative data sources and what we find in IPUMS, and also that actually our baseline effects are robust to just using these average homeownership rates rather than those matched by marital status. It's a bit less precise, but this would also work in just using these alternative data sources. And so what we do with this, we map these estimated homeownership rates in countries of origin onto the country of origin of foreign-born residents in the US and their marital status that they have at the moment of when the census is taken. And the reason why we do this matching by marital status you can see from this table. So in this table, we show just sort of the top countries among foreign-born residents in the U.S. Top countries of origin. So those are Mexico, Puerto Rico, Philippines, India, and China. Puerto Rico is not necessarily a foreign country, but it's broken out as a non-mainland origin in the census. What you can see here is that HOCO, so home ownership in the country of origin, this term's going to come up a bunch of times, on average differs a lot across different countries, right? So it ranges from around 66 in Mexico to around 78% in China. And there's a big difference among married populations and unmarried populations. So in Mexico, this doesn't seem to make a big difference. But for instance, among native-born Americans, actually, there's a big gap in terms of homeownership rate among people who are married and people who are not married. And that gap sort of exists in other countries as well. And so it matters in terms of trying to actually pick up on what the norms are for whether or not someone should own a home. It matters whether or not we're talking about someone who's married or not, because sometimes there might be cultural expectations around sort of acquiring a home or shifting into homeownership as someone gets married. And so we actually end up matching these homeownership rates based on your marriage status. And then outcomes in the US. So what do we use to look at what these foreign-born households then choose in terms of homeownership in the US? So we use ACS microdata on foreign-born household heads of the same age as what we constructed from the international data. And so we just take the repeated cross-section of ACS data from 2005 to 2019 and find around sort of 3.4 million foreign-born households for whom we can also construct the homeownership in their country of origin. And so just as a reference point, so the foreign-born in general make up around 10% of the US population in the year 2000 and almost 14% in the year 2020. So this is a large share of the US population that we're talking about. As I already mentioned, we'll do some, we'll try to control for other characteristics of the countries of origins that might matter. So we collect some data as well on the characteristics of the countries people are coming from, the GDP per capita, inflation, urbanization, domestic credit, property rights, and investment freedom, and so on. So other things that might be driving the tendency towards homeownership. And we show that our results are pretty robust to that. And I'll show you that in a second. And then the last thing we need to do is that the ACS doesn't provide any information on household wealth, which might matter for whether or not someone chooses to buy a home. And so in order to deal with that, we impute non-housing wealth from PSID data. So we match wealth in the PSID data based on detailed socioeconomic and demographic characteristics to our characteristics in the ACS to try to sort of predict what we would expect the wealth to be for the foreign-born households. And that's sort of the best we can do in terms of trying to control for wealth here in this setting.
Gregor, we've got a couple hands. Gilberto was first.
Yes, just a simple question. Did you collect a household income data? Because it's important to differentiate when households have like joint incomes when they are married. Obviously, that will be more prone to home ownership and so on.
Yes. So I should have put this on the slide here. So we collect sort of a rich set of household characteristics you could think of. So like household income, how many children do they have? Are they married? Do they live with other people? How long have they been in the US? How old are they? And so on. And we'll actually end up controlling for sort of anything we can throw at it in terms of household characteristics we can get from the ACS, and including household income. Great question.
And then Jonathan has a hand up.
Yeah, hi, Gregor. So, I mean, the wealth one is going to be the big one, right? Like that's the one where you really want to know whether or not it's doing everything it needs to do to absorb all the other stuff, right? So, I mean, can you go into a bit more? I know you have a whole tab there. Maybe you're going to go a bit about how good the wealth imputation is, and also, I mean, in the end, are you also going to be able to handle, because there's a huge literature on parental transfers and home ownership? Are you going to be able to say anything about parental wealth? And
was another
parental wealth and home ownership basically at all?
So we can't really do parental wealth because we don't observe the exact characteristics of their parents. So there's sort of two. So first, let me click on wealth imputation. So the wealth imputation is sort of like, we're following this paper that sort of tries to impute wealth based on demographic characteristics. And it does sort of an okay job at doing this, as you might imagine, sort of that this is never going to be perfect. So as you said, there might be some worry that wealth might not be perfectly captured here. There are a couple of reasons why we're not super worried about this. So the first one is that at the end of the day, we're making a claim here about that country of origin plays a role in terms of driving your home ownership choice in the US. And so one channel through which this might matter is actually that your wealth accumulation changes in order to attain home ownership to some degree. So saving up for a down payment or something like that. And so there's one argument that wealth maybe is a bad control in this setting and maybe shouldn't be in there. But the concern, I think that is more implicit in what you're saying is that, well, maybe they come over with lots of wealth. Like maybe all the immigrants from particular countries, they just bring a ton of money with them, and that's why they're able to buy a house. And so one thing we look at is whether or not our findings are driven by people who came over recently, right? So like if this is about bringing wealth from the home country, you'd expect a lot of the effects to show up among people who immigrated over the last 5 years or so, and not as much for people who immigrated 20 years ago, because presumably the wealth they accumulate in their home country becomes less relevant over time, the more time they spend in the US. And we find that's the opposite is the case. So it takes people some time to sort of get their footing in the US, and these preferences for homeownership get expressed by people who've been here for a longer period of time. We also find that it works equally well for people who migrated here as children, who presumably themselves didn't bring any wealth, even though sort of your question about parent wealth still applies there. And then sort of the last point is that what would have to be the case is that even controlling for income and sort of all the educational attainment and all the other things that we can actually control from our data and that do highly correlate with wealth, it would have to be the case that somehow it's not just that wealth has something to do with homeownership. It would have to be the case that homeownership in your home country is always high exactly in the cases when there is unobservable wealth that people bring over to the US, and that then drives homeownership in the US in a way that is somehow completely unrelated to cultural preferences. So it's not just that there is this that wealth in the US is highly correlated with homeownership in a country of origin, but also that it's somehow an independent channel for homeownership that has nothing to do with whether or not they're interested in buying a home because of homeownership in their home country. And that seems sort of less plausible, especially given the large number of other demographic controls we have in the data.
So just one other quick question, like, so why are you predicting non-housing wealth as opposed to total wealth?
Because total wealth is going to be so in the way this is imputed, you would impute total wealth using their homeownership as a driver of total wealth. And so, of course, like using the homeownership as a control for whether or not they choose homeownership in the US wouldn't be a great control variable. So we're worried that would be a bad control.
I mean, I think it's kind of the opposite, right? Like, so, if you just bought a home, your non-housing wealth is really low, right? So whereas my total wealth doesn't change.
Your total wealth does, well, yes, your true total wealth doesn't change. In terms of the imputation, whether or not you bought a home is a big predictor, whether or not you own a home is a big predictor of wealth in general, sort of in the PSID. And so taking that as a predictor of wealth would mean that we're sort of predicting that we're controlling for homeownership to some degree while trying to predict homeownership. I mean, we can probably do a version of this that uses housing wealth. That's something we can put on our to-do list. But I'd be worried that is a bad control when we're trying to predict homeownership. Okay. All right. So why would we expect this to matter? So why would we expect origin country norms to affect tenure choice? So just to sort of fix ideas, we wrote down as sort of the simplest model of tenure choice we could think of. So if you have zero landlord profits, no borrowing constraints, which we'll relax a bit later, fixed housing consumption, and then your indifference is going to be if if you buy your house, right, you get your usual income Y that you pay some taxes on. You have an implicit sort of rent or mortgage payment. We'll assume that sort of rent and mortgage payments are the same in the setting, and you get some sort of tax shield from your mortgage payment. So tax times interest rate times prices. But you also get some sort of non-monetary benefit of owning a home. So in this case, so this factor phi here sort of summarizes all the other things that you might care about in terms of owning a home. This might be more control over your living space, but also in this particular setting, some sort of cultural benefit that you get from owning a home, some sort of some sense in which it makes you feel good to own a home. And so if you have a high affinity for homeownership, this idiosyncratic cost of homeownership phi is going to be lower. If you don't really care about homeownership, then the burden of being a homeowner might be higher. So this phi will capture this sort of cultural preference for homeownership. And then if you were a renter, you'd get your income net of taxes, and you just pay rent. So you wouldn't get the tax shield, you wouldn't get the sort of cultural benefit. And so what that then results in is that there's some sort of area of costs and benefits. So if we're plotting this just over the different tax rates that households might face in this graph at the bottom, there's some sort of cutoff tax rate where if you're below that tax rate, the costs of being a homeowner exceed the cost of being a renter. And so people at lower tax rates, which usually maps into lower incomes in the US, will choose to be renters. And then above that tax rate, the benefits of owning a home exceed the benefits of the costs of being a renter. And so you'll choose to be a homeowner at that point. And so if you have a larger cultural benefit of being a homeowner, so there's something, some warm glow or pride in your home that comes from having this sort of cultural affinity towards homeownership, that will shift down your owner-occupied user cost. And so that should mean that your cutoff for what it takes for you to become a homeowner in terms of the threshold tax rate, for instance, in this particular representation, should be lower, and so you should be more likely to choose homeownership as a result of that. The ideal thing to do here would be to be able to actually observe those user costs for particular users. User costs are notoriously hard to observe in the setting, and of course, we cannot observe this sort of cultural user cost. One thing we can observe, though, is whether or not people who are more likely to have a strong affinity for homeownership are more likely to own their home than others for a given tax rate. So the graph sort of makes it explicit with colors. There should be, if you're comparing the high line, which is people who don't have a high affinity for homeownership, to the lower owner-occupied user cost line, which is people who do have a high affinity for homeownership, there should be some range of taxes where below a certain level of taxes, everyone rents. At a sort of intermediate level of taxes, the people with a high affinity for homeownership are buying homes, and the people with lower homeownership affinity are renting. And then above a certain tax level, everyone ends up owning. And so the first sort of simple exercise we do is we map our estimated preferences for homeownership based on homeownership in the country of origin onto estimated tax rates for different households, and sort of just check what the homeownership rate is for different tax rates. And we find exactly what this simple model would predict. So as you see in this graph, if we plot homeownership rates in blue for people with a low affinity towards homeownership, so this is just splitting the sample down the middle into above or below median homeownership in the country of origin, and into high homeownership in the country of origin, you find exactly what this model would say, which is that the people with a high affinity for homeownership at any given tax rate are more likely to own a home. And that gap is larger at sort of lower and intermediate tax rates. Above a certain tax rate, everyone owns a home. But it's at these sort of lower and intermediate levels where this cultural difference really really opens up a gap. And so this is sort of our first sort of initial evidence that these cultural preferences seem to play a role here. How much homeownership people choose at different tax rates, and there's some sort of variation in terms of at which income levels this matters more. We of course try to test this more formally by running regressions. So what we want to estimate is whether or not homeownership for a particular household is predicted by where the household head is coming from in terms of their country of origin. So does the homeownership in the country of origin, this HOCO term, explain the homeownership of the household in the US? And so the sort of simple model I showed you predicts that should be a positive effect. And we, as a lot of the questions already suggested earlier, we really want to make sure we control for all the other household characteristics that might be driving homeownership behavior. And so what we control for is a sort of rich set of demographics that we can pick up from the ACS. So we control both linearly and non-linearly for household income. We control for a quadratic function of age of the household head. We control for educational achievement, how many children they have, how many relatives live in the household, how many years it has been since they immigrated to the US, because of this concern that was brought up earlier, that sort of if you came over very recently, perhaps your homeownership, your home purchase is driven by sort of money you made in your home country, or the particular way that you immigrated to the US. We control for marital status. And also we interact marital status and immigration categories, because it might be that the time you spent in the US only matters for your homeownership decision if you're married, for instance. And then we also control for this net worth variable that we construct using this imputation that I mentioned earlier. Okay, so
we have a couple hands.
Yep.
Tianfu was first.
Yeah. Hi, Gregor. Just quick clarification on your HOCO variable. How do you actually construct this HOCO variable? Is it based on the time they enter the US?
So
in the time varying? Yeah.
So the HOCO variable is not time varying. I guess it's a little confusing because we have the time index here, but the HOCO variable itself is not time varying for each country of origin. So we are limited in terms of the number of international census samples that we get. So depending on the country, there'll be sort of like 1, 2, in very rare cases, maybe 3 times that these international censuses are taken. And they rarely align between countries. And so we basically decided that we would take the sample for each country that is closest to the year 2000, which is sort of the beginning of our sample, and take homeownership in that year. There's a debate to be had about what actually should be the right mapping. So if we had perfect data available in terms of every single year for each country of origin, we knew their homeownership precisely by marital status, what exactly should be the sort of cultural homeownership that we should plug in there. And there's some debate to be had if that should be sort of the homeownership at the time that they left their origin country, or whether or not the sort of ongoing connection to people from that home country means that actually current homeownership is sort of the right comparison variable if we're thinking of some sort of like keeping up with the Joneses model of, well, you see, for instance, you see your friends buy a home on Facebook back in your home country. Now you want to buy a home too to keep up with them. Maybe it's current homeownership that matters. So there's some debates we had sort of like which actual like time slice there would matter the most. But in our setting, like we're limited by the fact that that in practice, homeownership is very sparsely measured in most countries. And so we just take one time slice for the country near the year 2000 and apply that. And so there's probably some measurement error in that, which might bias our estimates downward, but you'll see in a second that nonetheless, it still works.
And Ryan also has a hand up.
All right, I was on mute. I have a question in terms of about the HOCO variable.
Mm-hmm.
That variable may take into consideration, it may be driven by the ability to get a mortgage or certain tax benefits in a certain country. So is there any concern that, that home ownership rate and likely likelihood of someone actually purchasing a home may be driven by not necessarily cultural implications, but maybe macroeconomic factors, political factors, and ability to get a mortgage. And that may be different in the US than in their country of origin.
So I think what I'm hearing there is that first, if the calling it culture might be misleading, and that sort of things other than culture matter in terms of these things in countries of origin. First, I fully agree with that. I think we've struggled a lot with what to call this. At the end of the day, it's a country-driven affinity for homeownership, which doesn't really roll off the tongue, but we've struggled with what exactly to call it. We're very happy with any sort of driver in the country of origin that might drive homeownership, to the degree that it transfers with you to the US in terms of like you learn something about whether or not homeownership is desirable, either, for instance, because homes were a great investment in your country of origin, or there was political uncertainty, and so the home was sort of the only thing you could hold on to. That is all fine to the degree that it ends up driving your homeownership behavior in the US, which then has an impact on your economic outcomes, right? That's ultimately what we care about. And so there's lots of different things that could explain homeownership in the country of origin. And any of those are sort of fine with the story we're trying to tell here. We have looked a bit about what exact characteristics in the home country ends up driving homeownership there. People could write whole books about sort of what drives homeownership in a cross-country comparison. It does seem to be that sort of better investment opportunities outside of housing lower homeownership a bit. There's GDP actually has a sort of ambiguous relationship with homeownership. But yeah, there's a bunch of different country level drivers. But in our case, all we care about is that what you took away from your home country was some sort of attitude towards homeownership, and you brought that with you to the US. We do actually have a robustness check where we try to control for all these home country characteristics and find that they don't really matter that much. But yeah, in our setting, like we don't really care that much what exactly caused that affinity to come about in your home country. As for I think the second part of your question, maybe that's going to be different in the US. I think that's basically an argument to say that we shouldn't find an effect here, right? Just that if something formed homeownership in your home country and that doesn't exist anymore in the US, there shouldn't be a pass-through here. There should be, if it is the case that these attitudes are not persistent, when the context changes, your behavior changes, then we shouldn't find anything. And I'll show you in a second that we do.
Looks like Tim has a hand up.
Yeah, just a really quick question on a point that was made about the HOCO variable just being that snapshot at the country level at 2000. Are we sure that just smoothing it over to a country level and ignoring both variation over time and over sub-region, for instance, India is a really big country where some immigrants from not only different regions will have different interactions with being landowners. Are we sure that this modeling choice will just be classical measurement error and not some sort of modeling error that could introduce some sort of endogeneity?
I can't. I mean, I'd be open to suggestions. I think the main issue is that we can't measure the sub-region homeownership easily in the other countries. And again, sort of it would probably take like a lifetime of researching each country to do that precisely right. But I think more importantly, I can't really think of a strong story why like neglecting regional subvariation in homeownership wouldn't just introduce classical measurement error here. Like it would have to be the case that for countries that have a particular average homeownership, there's differential selection of people to come from regions that have particular unobservable characteristics uncorrelated with demographics in the US, which then leads to homeownership behavior in the US that is different. And none of that is correlated, and none of that is driven by the average homeownership in the country of origin. It's just somehow driven that average homeownership in the country of origin drives differential selection into which subregions people are from, which then drives homeownership behavior in a way that's unrelated to preference for homeownership. So I find it hard to tell a story where that matters, but I think it's an important concern. We'd love to have sort of better detailed data, but for now, I think this is as good of a measure as we can create, and I can't really come up with a good story of why this would matter. right. I need to move on a bit time-wise. All right. So what do we find? So when we actually run this regression, so again, this is the regression, and we're just looking at this pass-through. We find sort of strong, significant pass-through. So around 15%. So 15% here means that so the dependent variable actually is in 100 percentage points, and so is this HOCO variable. And so the pass-through here means that if your homeownership in country of origin goes up by 10%, we'd expect your homeownership in the US to go up by 1.5%. And so the one standard deviation difference in homeownership across countries of origin here explains around 2.8 percentage point differences in homeownership in the US. This is pretty large. Homeownership just doesn't vary that much in general in the US. And so this is actually a pretty large share that's explained. So it explains around a third of the gap between immigrants and natives in the US, if you wanted to compare to something like that. It's sometimes easier to sort of see this intuitively by just plotting this at the country level. So at the bottom, this shows homeownership in country of origin residualized with regard to all the control variables that I mentioned. And then vertical axis is actual homeownership in the US, again, residualized, and sort of shows how different countries match up. The important thing to notice here is that it's not really just that rich countries have high homeownership rates or something like that, which I think goes against some of the sort of concerns that, oh, maybe you're just bringing wealth or something with you. So like some of the countries with very high homeownership rates are Vietnam, Romania, Cambodia, Hungary, Nicaragua. And so it's really not just sort of it's not that obvious how these would cluster in terms of what they all have in common that might drive the homeownership in the US. And just to pick out a couple ones, so for instance, you see that Austria and Switzerland are sort of countries with reasonably low homeownerships in their country of origin. They have very well-developed rental markets. Or Romania, for instance, an interesting historical story where lots of families attained homeownership right after the end of the Cold War because they got sort of the apartments given that they were living in at the time. And so it has homeownership in country of origin that's in raw terms is in the 90s, and that has persisted over time. All right. There's some variation in heterogeneity in these effects that I just showed you. So it's a bit smaller for male household heads, and it's a bit smaller for college graduates, as you might expect. That maybe culture matters less there. But I can talk a bit more about heterogeneity later if we have some extra time. All right, so we do a bunch of robustness checks. I can go into more detail on these later if we have more questions at the end. I don't want to talk through all of them in detail right now. I think a bunch of them already came up in the questions that were asked. So sort of we exclude the largest origin countries and still find the effect. We control for what the origin countries are like in terms of a bunch of different characteristics we can sort of pick up from international country comparison data. We try a different data set for collecting this HOCO data, and that doesn't seem to drive our results. We look at just did you come recently or did you come a long time ago to the US? And it's actually driven by the people who came to the US a longer time ago. And we control for average migrant characteristics from those particular countries. So if people are sort of selected in a particular way, like people from that country are always really highly educated or something, we try to control for that, and that also doesn't seem to drive the results. All right. So that was the first part. The first part is there's pass-through from what is the homeownership in your country of origin to whether or not you actually end up choosing to buy a home in the US, controlling for all sorts of demographics. How does this affect financial behavior? So we construct sort of a simple model based on an old paper by John Bruckner on how you would think about this in the presence of borrowing constraints. So in the presence of borrowing constraints, you need to save some sort of money S to get over a threshold alpha of the housing price. Only then are you allowed to buy a home. And you have a sort of two-period model of in the first period you rent, and then you try to save up money in order to buy a home for the second period if you're so inclined. What we find, and I'm not going to show you the details right now, is that in that setting, you're more likely to save up to buy a home in the second period if you have a higher affinity for homeownership. And then in particular, this borrowing constraint is going to matter is going to matter more for you if you have a higher affinity for homeownership. So if that borrowing constraint is relaxed, you're going to respond more if you're in general more interested in homeownership. So that when the opportunity finally opens up, you're more likely to then actually try to buy a home. And we try to test that prediction by constructing a measure of access to mortgage credit. So credit supply has played an important role during the housing boom and the Great Recession in terms of enabling marginal home buyers to buy houses, but then also like driving delinquencies and foreclosures. And so we try to see if we can construct a measure of sort of credit supply shocks at the local level and see whether or not homeowners with foreign-born residents with different affinities for homeownership respond differently to that. In particular, the important identification issue here is that homeownership and credit, of course, at a local level might have some sort of reverse causality issues. And so we really want to come up with a measure that exogenously eases credit supply in particular regions, and that is available for our time period is the important part. Set the context. How do different groups with different affinity for homeownership sort of fare over the housing cycle of the 2000s? We split this up into 3 periods: so the boom of the early 2000s, then the bust period, and then the recovery period afterwards. All groups, so native, low affinity and high affinity groups, all are increasing their homeownership during the housing boom. And then we've had declining homeownerships in the years thereafter. But the high affinity foreign-born are actually, they do much better. They increase their homeownership much more than the other groups at the run-up to the housing boom. And they also have a smaller decline in homeownership in the subsequent years. So it seems like they're sort of more eager to acquire a home when credit is eased, and then they hold on to that home more, while the other groups are sort of see declining homeownership. And so how do we construct this exogenous credit supply shock? So we build on a small number of papers. One of them is by Garcia in Real Estate Economics in 2020 that try to identify sort of non-local shocks to credit supply that are driven by sort of banks in general being able to expand their lending nationally in a way that's unrelated to what's going on in your particular location. And so the way this is constructed is that we take for a particular time period. So time periods are going to be these 5-year chunks that I just showed you, sort of boom, bust, and recovery period. For each lender, we take their change in lending over the time period, and we just project it onto county level fixed effects and lender fixed effects. So it's just sort of decomposing it into which part of the lending is driven here by something that is particular to individual counties, and what is something that is unique to that lender in terms of the variation in lending. And then we're going to hold on to these fixed effects, and then we'll take these fixed effects and construct first a raw shift share shock to local mortgage credit supply that is your local area's exposure based on pre-period lending. So it's sort of your share of exposure. How much lending does that bank normally do in your area, multiplied by this estimated lender fixed effects, that is the degree to which that bank expanded lending in that time period, again, in a way that holds constant sort of geography-specific effects that we would think of as sort of credit demand shocks at the time. And then we take that sort of shift share shock to local mortgage credit supply, and we residualize it again with regard to these estimated, so these are from here, these estimated local demand shocks, both for the number of loans that are given out and for total lending volume, to make sure that our shift share shock is not driven by something related to sort of local shifts in credit demand. And so the residual from that regression then we call the non-local lending shock. So this is the sort of the part of local lending that is not explained by local shifts in credit demand and is driven by just your local area's exposure to the particular banks that are nationally expanding their lending at that particular moment.
Gregory, you've got 5 minutes.
Yep. All right. And so what do we do with this shock? So the ACS is a repeated cross-sectional sample, so we don't really observe groups over time, and so we do a repeated cross-section. So we construct a panel from repeated cross-sections here. So we collapse our data into these above and below median HOCO groups, and so we can then construct a sort of long difference stacked panel of how does each of those groups within each county, so these above and below median HOCO groups, in each county, in each time period, sorry, this should be time period, not year, how do they fare over time? So during the boom, bust, and recovery, how do their homeownership rates change, and how does that depend on these local credit shocks? And so the assumption here is that your local exposure to credit shocks is uncorrelated with the differential uptake of homeownership among these different HOCO groups. And so even if you're worried about sort of maybe these credit shocks, the way I showed you the construction right now, maybe there's still some sense in which they're not really exogenous with regard to your local area. The requirement here really is that they're exogenous with regard to differential uptake of homeownership among HOCO groups, which should be a sort of weaker identification assumption in this setting. And then we estimate, does your group's homeownership change more or less when there is a local credit shock? And does that depend on who your group is? So generally, when there's a credit shock, we would expect homeownership to go up. So when credit is eased, credit supply goes up, homeownership should increase. But does that depend on which group you're in? If you're US, and we distinguish US born, so the baseline is going to be the low HOCO group. We'll compare all the other groups to them, and the other groups are US born, high HOCO, Mexican born, and then all the people for whom we couldn't construct this HOCO data. We control for sort of reasonably tight local fixed effects. So we control for static county level differences and also for commuting zone level trends in overall homeownership. So this is really just like relative to your local commuting zone trend. Does your group pick up homeownership more depending on your affinity for homeownership when this credit is eased? Okay, so what do we find? So first off, these constructed local lending shocks, they do really predict local lending, which is good. And they also strongly predict local homeownership. So homeownership goes up at the county level when credit supply is eased and local lending goes up. And then the last two columns are what we really care about, which is, does this differ by whether or not you are in the high HOCO affinity group? So like, if you care a lot about homeownership, does your group somehow increase its homeownership more? And there what we find is actually that they seem to be driving most of the increase in local homeownership. So when local credit expands, yeah, there's positive effects on the US born that live in that area and the low affinity groups. But the really big significant impact is on the foreign born who really care about homeownership. So they really increase their uptake of homeownership. And that's a pretty large effect here. So this would explain a 1 standard deviation higher credit shock in your area would explain something like 120% of the divergence between low and high HOCO groups. Of course, not all areas have 1 standard deviation higher shocks in credit supply. That's why we get the number here that's sort of bigger than 100%. But the difference here across areas that get big credit supplies and have lots of high affinity for homeownership groups really is big in terms of explaining the divergence between these groups over time. Okay, and the last analysis in the last minute, the one big question might be, well, does this then lead to bad outcomes? So if they pick up all this credit, do they then get foreclosed more? I seem to have dropped. Oh, there it is. Sorry. And the easiest way to show this is with a nice figure. In general, it is the case that if your homeownership goes up, this is from a cross-section of 2013 and 2017 American Housing Survey waves, which is the only times that we can actually pick up on these delinquencies. But you're less likely to miss your mortgage payments in general if you have higher affinity for homeownership. So if you care about housing, you're going to pay your mortgage. And then there's lots of papers that claim that sort of during 2006, 2007, there was a period when people bought a home during those years. They're really likely to default on their mortgage, right? So sort of the peak boom years. And so if we split up the sample, it turns out that this effect of homeownership, this sort of protective effect, is mostly driven by that boom period. So the people who bought at the peak of the boom and who are most likely to default, if they don't really care about homeownership, they're much more likely to be delinquent on their mortgage. If they really care about homeownership, they're going to hold on to that home and actually pay their mortgage. And so there's a difference here in terms of mortgage delinquency behavior that seems to be associated with your affinity for owning a home. All right, and I'm out of time. And so to conclude, we show in this paper that there is sort of strong pass-through from what's going on in your home country in terms of homeownership to whether or not you are going to end up choosing a home in the US, controlling for all sorts of demographics we can think of. And that seems to affect your take-up of credit supply expansions. So people who care a lot about homeownership are more likely to enter into homeownership when credit is eased. But they're also more likely to hold on to their home when they're more likely to default. And as I mentioned earlier, we're sort of working on how this affects the then wealth dynamics for these different groups, as well as their actual tendency to default on the loan. I showed you delinquency, but not default. But that's still in the works. All right. Thank you for listening, and also for the already very active questions. I'm looking forward to answering more of those.
Looks like we have a hand. Jeff?
Can you go back to slide 30?
30. All right.
31.
31.
What might be interesting to see is to allow for a different impact if there's a negative credit shock versus a positive credit shock. I mean, this is kind of, you have this as linear this way, but it may be different. You know, it showed a little bit when you showed your bar charts that maybe there's a different impact. You know, when there was a drop in credit supply versus an increase.
Yeah,
that would be easy to do, but that could add an interesting nuance to this.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, that's something we can do. Thanks.
I have a question on your modeling result that high HOCO consumers are more responsive to credit shocks.
Let me go back there.
That's not necessarily how my intuition would work. So in my intuition, it'd be hump shaped. So if someone doesn't want a home no matter what, they're not going to be responsive at all. And if someone desperately wants a home and will do anything to get one, they might not be responsive at all anyway, because they can get a home no matter what credit looks like. So according to my non-model intuition, it should be people in the middle who are kind of near the margin of being homeowners or not, who would be most responsive. I'm just wondering why my intuition works different than the model.
The difference, I think, is between your intuition and the model. I think, if I understand this correctly, is that that there's always some reason why someone might not be a homeowner in this model. So there are no people who are sort of always homeowners, and so and people who are never homeowners. And so everyone's always a little bit marginal here, in some sense. I can imagine that. Yeah, which I think aligns with sort of the empirical data, in the sense that we don't observe groups that are like 100% homeowners or 0% homeowners. It's always a little bit more in the middle. But yeah, I think that's the main difference here. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Hi, Guru. I found that I think you are using different fixed effect for different models. Is there any reason of
which particular one? You mean the table at the end, or which one are you thinking about? This one?
For example, there's a table using commuting zone as a fixed effect, and here is country fixed effects. This is a country or region or country county?
Yeah. So here so the shocks that we construct are at the county level. And so we can do county fixed effects, and then we try to sort of commuting zone trends, sort of the tightest we can do without eliminating our shock in some sense. And then the other shock structure that you're thinking about is it this one? Here we also have these commuting zone level trends. We don't have county level fixed effects because we don't I guess we could have county level fixed effects in here.
Right.
There's no good reason for that other than that we didn't go back and align all the fixed effects. I think that's something we can go back to do. Good catch.
Jung has a hand up.
Thanks for the presentation. I just have a question on the second sets of regression results on so here you don't really calculate control for the wealth or the income of different groups of HOCO. So I'm just wondering if the high HOCO population or households have higher wealth. So they're kind of it's not really a preference that the low HOCO people don't want to hold on to their homes during the Great Recession. It's just that they had less incomes or wealth to kind of sustain their whole. So how do you kind of capture for those?
So we actually control for group level fixed effects. So any sort of static differences in wealth in general are going to be captured here. So we're just identifying off of the time variation within a local group. So within a particular county, the high HOCO versus low HOCO differences in wealth. So statically, those are going to be picked up by these county by group fixed effects. So if they're just generally wealthier, and if the high HOCO people in Topeka are always wealthier than the low HOCO people in Topeka, then we're controlling for that. And so we're identifying only off of the sort of time variation here in terms of the credit shocks.
And Yi has a hand up.
Yeah, hi. Just curious about are they all the first-time buyer? Any variations for first-time buyer or not? Because I just assume if they are very keen on homeownership, the HOCO group, and then they maybe want it just once I achieved my target of having a home, that's fine, and then doesn't matter about whether they're first time or not.
You mean? Sorry,
are they the first time buyer? I mean,
yes.
for them, the household had. So any variation if they are not. So any subgroup.
So the thing that we're able to measure is, do you transition into homeownership? So does the rate of homeownership go up in this group? Which suggests that either people didn't own a home beforehand, or they or they maybe had owned a home, or they're first-time buyers. We're not measuring do they buy a home. We're measuring do they transition into homeownership.
I see.
And we can't observe if this is the first time they're buying a home, but we're measuring do you go from being a renter to being a homeowner.
I see. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
So one of the things I find most interesting about changing homeownership patterns comes from the kind of moving to opportunity literature, which finds that some of the largest effects of improving a situation where someone lives is on the kids and their future outcomes. Have you thought about looking at that at all?
Yeah. So there's a number of different sort of follow-on projects we've planned. So so one of them is how might this affect sort of other people involved, like kids down the line, for instance. And the other one is around sort of there might be local areas. So this is also related to the moving to opportunity project in some sense. There might be local spillovers to sort of other local variables like economic mobility, intergenerational mobility, schooling or crime outcomes in a local area if homeownership is higher, right? And so one thing that's really nice about this sort of homeownership that's driven by where you originally came from rather than something about the local area you're currently living in is that we can use it as an exogenous driver of homeownership at a neighborhood level, right? So if you happen to have a lot of immigrants in a particular area that might have a higher affinity for homeownership, and if one could construct sort of a plausibly exogenous way of assembling those foreign-born residents in a particular area, and then they choose to buy a home because they're more interested in that, maybe that can allow us to better identify some of these effects that are traditionally attributed to homeownership, like being more civically engaged, having lower crime rates, and sort of enabling higher intergenerational mobility for kids, as you sort of mentioned. And so that's something that we're thinking about doing in follow-up projects.
Very cool. Anyone else?
Like I exhausted a lot of questions.
Definitely got the audience going, so that was great to see. Well, great. Thank you very much, Gregor. Really appreciated it. And I really hope everyone can join for our next seminar in 2 weeks. Look forward to it.
All right. Thank you so much, David. This was great. The questions and engagement were fantastic. Thank you.
Glad to hear it's helpful. Take care, everyone.